University. Just to let you know, this meeting is being recorded. We've got 3 really interesting talks today, each which will have about 20 minutes, followed by 10 minutes of questions. So if I could remind everyone to stay muted and with their videos off, and then at the end of the speaker, we can all give a polite applause virtually or physically, and I will ask people for questions, which I'm then very happy to chair. So without further ado, I'd please like to welcome Fran Myers to present their work on Imagining the Pandemic, Higher Education Tutors' Narratives and Photographs of Precarious Online Living and Learning. Fran, please.
Thanks very much, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen. My colleague, Hilary Collins, should be here. I don't think she's been allowed in, so she should be taking over me at the halfway point. So hopefully she'll be here in a moment. Okay, so our presentation title, Imaging the Pandemic, Higher Education Tutors' Narratives and Photographs of Precarious Online Living and Learning. Just a few introductory pieces to our research here. This was live research that we undertook during COVID to try and see sort of real-time emotional responses to what was going on, and I'll talk a little bit about the details of where we go, but if you can try and imagine yourself as back at that time as events were unfurling, rather than research that was done afterwards, if you see what I mean. Okay, so the contents of today's slide set, some practical accounts of what happened for pandemic teaching and learning, and I'm sure we've all got our own stories there. The approach we took, visual and textual approaches to our research design, the findings that we wanted to share with you on these narrative and photographic axes, precarity and security, time and perceptions of time and communication, then some discussion points, and we've got a slide about where we're taking our post-pandemic research next, and a few references if anyone's interested. So hopefully you can hear me okay. So what was going on in the background as the pandemic came in is we had a digital expansion in higher education, which was accelerating very, very rapidly variances in teaching roles and a big gap between those on permanent, fairly secure contracts, and a huge variety of 0 hours contracts, fixed term contracts, and the general air of precarity in the sector. The pandemic threw all that up in the air. It disrupted every role in higher education, everything we expected to do, our academic calendars, our academic journeys, and the work-based routines that we had in our institutions. What we found in terms of our literature review is that it was almost divided into 2 sections. The early studies that were coming out as the pandemic was going on tended to consider those online pivot areas and the work and the practicalities of kind of getting by in extremis, and work from Wright et al. Sort of saw 3 phases going on there between that initial emergency pivot, hybrid approaches that happen during those social distancing, as we're seeing very much coming through in the hearings and the COVID inquiry, those rule of 6 eras, the different regional variations, and then finally a sort of local quarantining and regulations, producing a sort of mixed offering like this way round the building, only so many students and allowed in at one time, or that mix and match of week A and week B that some institutions put in. And lots of us struggled to adapt their teaching styles, as reported on Rapanta et al., as learning what worked and what didn't work. We also saw a lot of extra tensions for those who had academic leadership roles, especially those who were not so senior, but as academic leaders who are forced to walk the talk in terms of being able to distance themselves at very senior level. And it was very difficult for people to plan when in fog themselves. Now a couple of years have gone past, we've seen a more reflective scholarship arm between sort of a couple of selected papers here. Digital repurposing for hybrid approaches, research from Gallagher et al. Up in Edinburgh, talking about sort of making use of long lost different Moodle sites or different team sites that people have had and then put back into use during the pandemic. And then from Littlejohn, tensions in space and place from working at home and hybrid working, and sort of resistance and acquiescence in those spheres. So, but in terms of our approach, what we tried to look at was, rather than the practicalities, was that emotional side of what was going on for people who were teaching in that crisis set state of betwixt and between, that liminal phase from Turner's lovely work based on work by Van Gennep initially, and that anthropological background. And we sort of noted from Winkler et al. Those times of difficulty are often really, really fraught and impact people's identity in negative and challenging ways. But we also saw some growth mindsets coming out from difficulties in pandemic, people learning skills that they'd never thought they would ever could or should have to use, and some positive outcomes there. Our paper considers a group of higher education teaching staff as they had to adapt at no notice, and a fresh opportunity to consider theoretical and methodological applications for liminality as a concept, but also blending it with the idea of extreme work. And while we wouldn't say that teaching was normally considered an extreme occupation, like being in the army or being perhaps in frontline medical care, those long hours, confusion and isolation in the pandemic produced a lot of the conditions we might expect. So in terms of our literature, we built on the work of Turner and those initial anthropological studies undertaken by Van Gennep on 3 stages of liminality. Separation, and in the pandemic that translated to that emergency, you must stay at home. A transition, that liminal phase when everything is different, things are not quite as they were, it's an alternative society, what we call, lockdown life, those routines we had, clapping for carers, baking banana bread, sharing rituals, family at a distance, and then incorporation as society reopens, but things are not quite as they were before, and using the concept of liminality as a lens to discuss that ambiguous space of teaching and learning work during the pandemic. The beauty of liminality is it fits that limited duration of time, that it might be painful, but it also could be positive. And that pandemic defined both via the individual experiences that lecturers undertook and as an objective condition, because we were all experiencing the rules and regulations, and it had its own rights, as I've just talked about, its own events and its own responses that were peculiar to lockdown life there. Blending this with extremity, this is based on initial work that was done by Hewlett and Luce back in 2006. And the initial work was done on people who had those sort of 24/7 jobs, the CEOs, the continent hoppers, also people that worked on projects that had to be finished immediately. And then that got picked up by Boskurt in 2015, who did a study on the deli counter of a supermarket at Christmas, and who helpfully teased out between an extreme job when things were permanently in this state of high voltage, high turnaround, and extreme work where the latter is seen as temporary. And she talks about routines of these extreme jobs. Retail is fairly what you'd expect, and then everything gets thrown out the window during Christmas when it goes into its extreme season. In higher education, she cites exam season and marking as being extreme for a very short amount of time. Everything is very, very brisk. These events are predictable. They go on the schedule. We know they're coming, but the pandemic was really not. And that built on research by Granter et al., who note the importance of particular contexts in their work on the armed services, where they have this match between times of absolute quiet and boredom to it's a life-changing situation and life and death and decisions are being made, and the bonding that takes place for service people and also in the emergency services as they do their necessary work. So what were the emotional responses to this time of difficulty? And we also built on work by Kai et al. On the extremity in the pandemic and being in a supermarket there again, like a war zone. Healthcare sector also generated, as you might expect, a great deal of pandemic work on extremity, ideas of alienation and anger against lack of PPE, not being able to see their families, but also love and hope and care for their patients. I'm going to hang on. Hilary, are you there?
Yes, Fran,
okay.
I am.
Tell me when to switch the slide.
All right, thanks very much. I'm conscious we've only got a few more minutes left, so I'll try to be as quick as possible. So our research design then, what was it? We used 12 usable sets of narratives from our participants who we'd actually gone out to and asked to volunteer for this piece of work. And they actually wrote narratives of their experience and during that time, really from the March through to the June. And so we wanted to allow photographs actually to give almost a kind of emotional crutch to participants so that they could use that as a point of explaining their own emotions. So choosing the photographs, but also explaining what their emotions were around that and what was happening to that at that point in time. And then we used a form of discourse analysis on those particular photographs. We have the next slide, thanks, Fran. So we ended up with some thematic sorting with 3 suggested headings. Now, our participants went into this project using those headings because we had actually previously highlighted them within another paper that was, just a conference paper. So we suggested these headings from them, and that was precarity and security, time and perceptions of time, and communication. And the next slide. So when we look particularly at precarity and security, there was an awful lot of emotion around these participants at that point in time. And it veered from the fear of losing jobs, the precarity of their own situation, and potential anger by the abandonment of university managers. Now, these were experienced distance learning teachers, but so by their very nature, they were physically alone in their own homes at this particular time and concerned for students who are also physically alone in their own homes. So this anger came about really because they thought they'd been abandoned by university managers. For example, one of the quotes here, 5 p.m. instructions on assessment changes. So the university tends to close down at Friday, 5 p.m, an instruction to change assessment processes, and comments on, well, who's going to be there but them online looking after the students as they panicked. But there were also positives, tributes to the comradeship of colleagues and people coming forward to help others at this particular time. So next slide. So we've chosen a couple of these. I actually think we've got one image missing actually on that on the right hand side. There should be on the right hand side an empty bus stop and a shelter, but it's not on my screen, so I'm hoping it's on yours. So we ended up doing photographic interpretation. We chose photographs that the participants had actually selected. We analysed them in 3 ways. Firstly, by a physical description of what was in the photograph and how it was taken, and also what we felt that meant. And then we related that to the narratives that the participants gave us on that. And here, these were two that were really, I suppose, systematic of this theme of precarity and security. One participant, giving us a photograph of her slippers and thinking that her working life was really now in a home office, no excuse to leave them, and actually wondering where work would come from in the future and what would actually happen to her. And the other one, there should be in here a photograph and an image of an empty bus stop and shelter where the road in front of it is quite dark. And this was where people were fearing the familiar. When were they ever going to get on that bus again and go somewhere? Or were they going to be confined to home for the future? And the next slide. So in terms of our findings on times and the perception of times, which is our second category, people became forgetful of time, asking every day, what day it was, what time it was. I'm sure we all remember that ourselves. And more time to get things done. But actually, there was a shift of routines and a shift of time. One participant saying, she established her time schedule from 3 a.m. to 9 a.m. when no one was about. So actually trying to capture these chunks of time for an individual, perhaps in a busy household, and trying to get some structure into their day, because the structure had all but left us at that particular point. So the next slide. Now here, these are two particular images. Initially in our findings, we had complete chaos where huge amounts of additional work were given to teaching staff because of the changes that had come out, changes in assessment, changes in communication. But actually, when that was actually starting to come into control, there were these pockets where people could actually start to work and do things that were more for them, that they hadn't had time before. And here we saw the development of almost temporary identities as people sought to regain themselves out of this chaos. And two examples here were one participant having time to create and finish a Japanese garden project that he'd been working on for a very long time, and actually get a chance to go out there and have a sense of time and appreciate his efforts. And another looking at the endless road where she could actually run along that road, but actually garnering time for herself, but very, very unsure of where in terms of time that was going to lead her and how long this was going to go on for. And the next slide. Now, communication was, I think, perhaps our most emotionally charged category. Given again that this was a distance learning university where things tend to be communicated via internet, via online, via messages, participants found they were really confused and noisy communications early on. And so nobody knew what was happening, and there was this sense of being completely abandoned by university leaders, and also that sense that perhaps there wasn't very much clear thinking going on at that particular time, and that filtered through in terms of this confused and noisy communications going on. However, that enabled our participants to take control of the situation themselves. Sorry, Sam, will I go on or will I?
Yeah, you've got 3 minutes left. It's just to remind you 3 minutes.
All right, thanks. Sorry, I just saw a stop hand. Okay, so communication then ended up here with a couple of slides on that. One was that the whole world was off kilter. Previous vacation image was shown here, showing this unsettling element of communication and contrast with that, and what that actually meant to people and who they were. And the next slide. So our main discussion points were that then some people clearly found lockdown challenging or damaging, and they found it very stressful, and they wondered where they were going to go in their careers. But actually there was an element of positivity as well, as some participants tried to almost create these alternative identities and actually come forward and take charge. It was almost reminiscent with a kind of World War II ethos of getting on with it and taking charge, and where management and leaders had fallen away to an extent, tutors were making decisions for themselves and there was less monitoring and control around them. So some of these were quite positive identity framings, but I think probably most importantly, this full psychological consequences have yet to emerge, and how we actually got there and how we are going to get forward in the future. And that's where our next work takes us, really, in our next slide, because it's what next. So at the moment we've done data collection now, looking at tutors and lecturers' experience as we are moving back to a physical built environment as kind of solid reality, and where that mix is coming from in terms of distance learning, where we're going with that. And we also have this paper under hopefully a final review for journal publication. And I think that's everything. Our selected references are here. And if you have any questions for us, we'd be delighted to take them.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Hilary and Fran. And bang on 20 minutes, absolutely perfect. So if people have got a question for either Hilary or Fran, if you could raise your hand virtually or physically, then I will come to you. If I've mispronounced your name, please correct me because I've just seen it for the first time. And likewise, if you've not renamed yourself, I'll just have to say what you've been named as. So a question first from someone who I'm guessing the name's not iPad, but if they could please come unmute themselves and ask their question. Thank you.
Apologies, Sam, I thought I'd changed my name to Andrea Cameron, but obviously not when I've gone into this next session, so apologies for that. And thank you very much for the presentation. It was very interesting because I've got a PhD student who's doing something similar, but looking at the experience of international students and of academics working with international students during the pandemic. But I noted earlier, Fran, and you had said about the 5, or apologies, I think it was the second speaker, Hilary, had said about the 5 p.m. emails sort of on a Friday, which, coming from managers, which weren't obviously well received. And I accept that, as I am one of those managers who was trying to avoid doing that. But I did wonder if any of the narratives were somewhat sympathetic at all towards managers, recognising that equally well, we were all just trying to do our best. Information was coming late. I was also dealing with the health service as well. And getting, again, a lot of mixed messages, things that changed on the go all the time. And so it wasn't an easy sort of thing for any of us to navigate because it was novel. So I just wondered if there was any sympathy on other sides from people recognising the novelty and the difficulty for people making decisions at this time.
Yeah, actually, it was, you've drawn out an interesting comparison, really, because we're 3 authors and all 3 of us at some point have been faculty managers and line managers to staff. And that's a particular role in our university. And there was a real element of comradeship with those direct line managers, understanding that they were going through the same things. I think the most animosity seemed to be from the higher up the grade level in terms of what we would class as the academic leaders per se, who remained quite very remote and at distance and didn't appear to sort of tackle the main issues. So the people who were on the front line working with the students realized and empathized with the faculty managers that they were kind of passing down these messages, so, which was very frustrating because, on a Thursday, you'd have one instruction, on a Friday, it would be contradicted. Assessment would change on a Wednesday and be cancelled on a Thursday. So I would say definitely yes, but less so higher up the grades.
I would also say, sorry, Hilary, to say it kind of compressed that first weekend. You saw this enormous mushroom of hostility. And then we actually later on, there was certainly one who took pains to say, now things have calmed down a bit. I am actually getting some praise from the higher ups, and it's starting to smooth down a little bit. And that person really took the time to say, I've been very hostile, but it's not so bad now. So I think there definitely was a later, I've calmed down a bit now. And that was the issue about doing real-time responses as well, that we saw the real emotion at the time rather than the considered responses.
Thank you, and I think I think as I'm one of those senior managers, it's good for us to also know that actually there's things that we could have maybe done better as well. So I think in terms of your dissemination, in terms of getting it to those who are higher up the tree to recognise that they need to think about how they're responding as well and how it's being perceived.
Thanks very much for the question, Andrea. Mark, did you have a question you'd like to ask Fran and Hilary?
Yeah, I do. Thank you. Again, fascinating presentation. And since I'll be talking about crisis leadership later, definitely interesting window into that. I was wondering if you could share a little bit more with the prompts you gave your participants and how you had them take pictures and talked with them about them. For context, I'm also studying academic well-being in higher education institutions here in Finland and using photo elicitation as a method. So I'm asking my participants to take pictures. So I'm particularly interested in how you went about doing it, especially in such a challenging time. So just if you could share a little bit on that.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, go ahead, Hilary.
No, you go first, Fran. You go first.
I was going to say we picked up. There was an article written by Kelly on nostalgia in a university who had used photo elicitation that gave us our initial idea, and we in that piece. The author talked about everyday capturing everyday moments of value, which is where the initial, that would be a nice idea to use the photographs. Over to you, Hilary, on that one.
Yeah, and actually my own background is in creative research, so I wanted to as well bring that to the table with my colleagues from my own book. But actually, the other thing was we ended up, from various constraints, having to ask our participants to do this at a distance with very little support from us. We did pay them. They did actually apply to do this and show an interest in it. And for that reason, we thought, well, rather than let them on their own, we gave them quite instructions on how to take what type of photographs to take, i.e. ones that we could reproduce rather than carved off the internet, and to use the photographs to help them explain their own position. Now it worked for us. We were obviously desperate to get the emotional content as well, but we didn't really we didn't write that particularly into the brief. So we did end up with some people who are very factually orientated and quite, I would say, quite dry, but this is my photograph, this is what I did. And others who seem to use it as an emotional outpouring and relate that back to what was happening to them personally in their family life as well. Now, because of the way our funding was and our interest was in their academic identity, we hadn't asked that particular question. So that came directly from the participants as they drew that into their life. So we did have some fairly harrowing tales of what happened to people. And in writing our paper up, we've gone back to all our participants and shown them excerpts of our work and say, are you happy with this? Because you may be identified, death of a parent, for example, the impact on long-term illness. And they have in turn written back saying, yes, we're happy for that. But it is something that really needs careful consideration, I think, in terms of the ethical stand.
That's great. Thank you so much, Hilary and Fran, and also for the question, Mark. And please continue the conversation in the chat as we're seeing, which is great. So on to our next speaker now for this session. So I'd just like to invite Bronwyn Woods to present their presentation on academic resistance in higher education institutions during times of precarity. Please, Bronwyn. I can't hear you yet, Bronwyn. I can see your slides though. I still can't hear you.
There we go. Let's try again.
Great.
All good. Lovely to join you all from New Zealand. We're at about 11:30 at night here, so it's a bit of a rough ride down under, but very nice to join you. What's that? No,
it's all good, Bronwyn.
All good. Okay, cool. So I want to begin with firstly acknowledging Rosalind Black, who's my colleague with this paper, who's here today. and a thank you to Peter Kahn, who got us initially involved in this conference as well. So I'm beginning with a photo taken this year of me and my colleagues protesting at the announcement that our secondary program was going to be completely cut due to financial cost cutting post-COVID at my university here in Wellington, New Zealand. This is probably what you view as academic resistance, but as we look at in this paper, we're going to really open up this idea into a far more generous and expansive kind of space as we understand what academics were doing during COVID times to take forms of academic resistance. So this work comes from a larger team, an Australian-New Zealand research project called Critical Times, Producing the Global Graduate, funded by Deakin University's Reddy Centre and Victoria University of Wellington. It was led by Rosalind Black, who is from Deakin University, Melbourne, with colleagues there, Kerry Gerard, Matthew Thomas, and Margaret Bierman. And we also had Lucas Walsh from Monash, Juliana Ryan from La Trobe, and Nadia Infants, our research assistant here in New Zealand. So the project was actually about trying to understand the imaginaries of the global graduate in terms of mobility, global-minded and competitive, that were promoted by Australian and New Zealand universities, and how teacher education academics within those universities understood and experienced their role in producing that graduate, and how they are shaped and shape the underlying discourses around the global graduate. So this was the impetus of our project that wasn't particularly looking at resistance. But what we found as we started to look at our data is that there were some very interesting ways that people responded to the grief, the anger that they felt at the time of the lockdowns, and how this then resulted in certain forms of action kind of to kick back during those times. So we were looking at Australia and New Zealand during the lockdowns, and I'm not completely sure how long your lockdowns were in the United Kingdom and so on, but in Auckland we had one lockdown was 107 days and Melbourne had more than 270 days. So these were quite extensive, and we wanted to see how teachers were responding to this during this time. So we conducted semi-structured interviews with 13 teacher education academics that took approximately 1 hour, 9 from Australia, 9 from New Zealand, and they were undertaken online during these lockdowns in about mid-2021. We used a reflexive thematic analysis, and our ethics was granted by Deakin University. So this is just a quick table summary of our participants. You can see there was a good mix between experienced, early career and mid-career academics. We decided this was an important aspect because it indicated different responses to the pandemic according to experience and time and so on. So whilst we, as I said, didn't initially start by looking at resistance, what emerged was some quite interesting forms of strategies and tactics that academics were taking in response to the massification of education, the digitalization of learning, and the weakening of relational pedagogies and community connections during this time. So they rarely used the word resistance, they didn't talk about protest, but what we started to see was ways in which they were kind of kicking back in multiple kind of different forms. So we went in trying to understand that in some ways resistance has been narrowly defined, and we wanted to open up that into a far greater potential for what this might look like while people were primarily online. In addition, we were curious to see how this COVID moment was indicative of former and future patterns in higher education, and how academics might negotiate the multiple contradictory aspects of neoliberal spaces, techniques, and subjects. So we feel the work had longevity beyond just that moment of the pandemic, because we were interested in a much broader conception of resistance. So what we found when we started to do this analysis that was theoretically informed as we started to kind of look through this data was that there were 3 types of resistance that we could see that educators used. The first and most common one was that education itself was a form of resistance. And there was a multiple different ways. There was, in this case, 3 ways that we saw people using education as a form of resistance to promote inclusion, radical hope, and enhance social justice. So the first of these was strategic selection of critical knowledge. So this was teachers choosing to pick certain educational topics to encourage their pre-service teachers to critique forms of imposition and exclusion, such as racism, sexism, colonization, and to promote a broader suite of knowledges and understanding of the world. So an example of this is Colin, an academic from Australia, who talked about trying to get the students to build connections and tear down the walls between the classroom and the rest of the communities. And it's often around a particular issue. So things like sustainability, bushfires, obviously very Australian, and refugees, migrants, you know, it's one of those big global citizenship issues we're all conscious that we're going to be dealing with. So his use of issues was as a way to get students to interrogate their prior understandings, and also to think about the world in perhaps fresh ways. In New Zealand, Salisi, one of our Pacific educators in New Zealand, was very keen to talk about how pedagogical acts could challenge the very traditional Eurocentric field of teacher education. For him, this involved being able to disrupt some of those systemic structures that disable generative ways of thinking around pedagogies, around knowledges that matter to people, in order to make space for Pacific learners, knowledge, identities, and culture. So a second type of education as resistance was one that many of us will be familiar with, was the attempt to develop critical consciousness in a Freirean type of idea through the way that educators were teaching, and as a form of praxis or action and reflection in society. So this strategy largely utilized the space of the classroom as a space of resistance in the absence of being able to move easily into the community. So this was often an online space, not necessarily a classroom space. And in describing it, our participants drew directly on theorists. Because these were teacher educators, they knew themselves the theories and they brought them in. So for example, Colin refers to Paulo Freire talking about, I don't think it's just enough to stuff young people's heads full of what it might mean to be an active citizen. It's got to be something that they do, and they've got to do it while they're at university. Otherwise, it's never going to be done. So he was drawing quite heavily on the idea of praxis there. And Carl, an experienced Australian academic, drew on John Dewey's idea to talk about education as something that's holistic, something that is reflected upon, and something that is about making connections. And so even the way they were teaching was referring to a type of resistance in the way that they taught. The last example of education itself as resistance was a type of utopian pedagogies that Bell Hooks talks about, which was to name new and alternative ways of being and teaching that could humanize teacher education. And what we found was that the academics were often quite utopian because things had broken down and they were teaching online. They couldn't go into the communities. They couldn't do field trips. They couldn't do global trips. So they started to develop an alternative in their minds about what this might look like. And so this was alternative ways of even developing social relationships, alternative ways of being, naming things that might be different. So Corinne here, from an experienced academic from New Zealand, talked about the young people that she was teaching that were willing to stand back and say the world is a perilous place, whether it's COVID, climate change, war, conflict, forced migration, and in narrating their voices, it's time for us young people to forget what we've actually been taught or how we've been shaped, or not to take the majority role models that we see and forge a path on our own, not as individuals, but collectively as this particular generation, in order to save this world. So a lot of that was a deferred idea. It wasn't happening at the time in a way that you could quite see. But the idea of utopian pedagogies evokes that sense of a way we could be, even if we can't be right now. So a second key way that we saw everyday activisms, and this was primarily using feminist theory to look at how we even understand resistance, was forms of resistance that operate through relational encounters and an ethic of care. So this often involved creating spaces for care in the uncaring institutions that these participants were in. It included compassion for oneself as well as others as a tool for disrupting and the isolating norms within the university and creating spaces for new academic possibilities. So Simone here, an early career academic in New Zealand, talked about how one of the dangers of COVID is that we're very focused on individualism, on self-directed, self-managing learning. So in response, her pedagogies drew on Māori or Indigenous perspectives where relationality or strong connections as people was really important. So she talked about trying to produce graduates who were attuned to humanity, to social justice, and to taking action, and that they would have a good understanding of themselves as somebody in New Zealand, but also a person within the world. So she was trying to use that sense of being a part of something bigger than yourself at this time as a kind of resistance. The final one of this type of category of everyday activisms, we draw on Zambilis's work in 2021 and Bungalia in 2019, who talks about even a further form of everyday activism was that of refusal. So refusal is not necessarily an act of opposition, but we can see it as a kind of absenteeism or a disinvestment from rules of engagement. So an example of this was Caleb in New Zealand, who, using his professional imperative as a teacher educator, included finding areas where I feel have a voice or an opportunity to challenge. And by implication, that was reducing challenging places where there was no opportunity to even have a say on anything. So his academic stance recognized that actually we're all constructed by this thing called education. And so we can keep refining and redefining it, and we don't have to accept it. And that was that sense of refusal that was creating a bolt hole or a breathing space in Webb's words, where statements and actions of resistance became possible. So unlike my initial slide where I was protesting with my colleagues, we found very few examples of public opposition. That was partly to do with very strongly the shutdown times, the lack of ability to be on the streets, but also we were desperately fighting. Everyone was fighting for their jobs. And I use the word we as the researchers in this were often very, felt a lot of empathy for our colleagues as we could see what was happening. So we have here Gidget, an experienced academic from Australia, who actually appeared to be quite energized by this kind of direct resistance. And she was critiquing not only her university's replacement of face-to-face with online lectures and tutorials, but actively contesting them right at what she called fighting City Hall, the upper vice chancellor, and all of those people. You have to make a case for why you would be doing these things that you're trying to do, so you're always fighting. So another early career academic, Caleb in New Zealand, described an instance where the senior management were putting on them a whole new software system called Canvas, probably half of us are using it now, which was driven by the need to recruit more students, especially international. And the logic was that they would no longer be teaching the lectures, that they'd be recorded one year and used year after year. So he describes as launching a bit of a coup collectively to push back and protest against this new software. So yeah, this type of oppositional stuff was rare, but still happening in some cases. So one of the challenges our research faced was how resistance itself could be defined and understood. And our initial dismissal of participants as lacking resistory tendencies relied on rather thin notions of resistance, and in particular, just that very common one, public opposition as resistance, which we have in this left column here. But what we found is as we started to open up theory to actually redefine, to reinterrogate some of these actions we saw, we started to see a lot more generative and open space, which we could call resistance. So we use theory like critical pedagogy to develop this idea of education as resistance, which then we found 3 different types of categories, which we've talked about: critical content selection, developing critical consciousness, and utopian pedagogies. The everyday activisms was primarily drawn from feminist and post-structural theories. And as we applied it, we could see this way that collegiality was being used as a strategic form of resistance to defy the uncaring and isolating normative kind of practices that were happening, and how relational care and refusal became ways that you could quietly but very solidly take resistance against the very dominant neoliberal powers that were there. So what we wanted to offer in our contribution of this research was this typology as an example, I'll just flick back aside, for others to use, to develop, to expand upon, to critique, because we'd be interested to see the longevity of this. We believe it goes beyond the COVID moment, this type of framing, and we'd be very interested to know if there were other forms that we have missed as we have been doing this analysis. So it gave us some fresh insights, this research, into how teacher educators didn't necessarily see themselves as resistory academics, but actually in their practices, they were illustrating many, many ways in which they were taking on and defying some of the changes during COVID. It gave us some glimpses into the multiple and emergent forms of resistance that they used to disrupt some of the massification and the digitalization of learning, to defy what they saw as weakening of relational pedagogies and community connection, and to foster and protect criticality in teacher education and their graduate teachers. So what we hope is that this typology could be a much more generative idea of resistance, and recognizing the multidimensional, fluid and generative ways in which academics chip away at the micropolitics of power. So it gives us some idea of the cracks in the neoliberal university that are still present for academics to pursue, even though they have been closing in recent times. And the importance of exploring conditions of possibility, even in those utopian kind of ways that weren't quite present now, but could be present in the future. So we want to continue this generative conversation about academic resistance and critical times, and very much look forward to any thoughts that you have about this. Thank you. Just to add, the paper is in a forthcoming special issue on precarity and illusions of certainty in higher education, in teaching in higher education. So look forward to getting that out soon. Thanks a lot.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Bronwyn. Perfectly on time as well. Bronwyn, if you're able to stop sharing your screen just so we can see everyone's faces, if that's okay. And if people have got questions that they'd like to ask, please raise your hand physically or virtually, and I'll come to you in time. Bronwyn, I just had a question, if that's okay, to kick things off. And first of all, I want to say thank you so much for staying so late. Like, it's really appreciated. How did you find your own positionality as a researcher who was, you know, very much affected by these issues? Yeah, affected your analysis and the whole approach to the research as well.
Yeah, this was very key for us, because we almost wanted to interview ourselves, because we were living and breathing exactly the same kind of thing. We were all involved in teacher education. And so it became part of our analysis was involved in our own experiences that helped us perhaps see some fresh insights here. And we've written that positionality into the paper because it is very, very key. We're not trying to say that it wasn't there. Roz, do you want to add anything to that?
No, thanks, Bron. I think you've really captured that. I mean, that kind of, I mean, the whole project, one of the motivations of the project was actually to, in a sense, put ourselves and our colleagues under the research microscope. So we were implicated in the research very consciously, very deliberately from the very beginning.
That's great. Thanks so much. Peter, did you want to come in with a question?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Bronwyn and Rosalind as well. It's very good to have the presentation. I'm interested in the language, really, in that you've used resistance as quite a key term. When you think of the sort of other terms one could have used citizenship or activism or that kind of, which is in some ways could have a broader landscape already within it. How do you see focus on resistance, particularly rather than a sort of wider term like citizenship, which could incorporate a range of types of different activity on the part of academics or teachers?
Yeah, very good question. I think one of our reasons was we wanted to convey it was somewhat oppositional, whereas a term like citizenship may not always be that. But what we wanted to do was open up that idea of oppositional to include a whole lot more things. I think we were also drawn by a long tradition in particularly sociology of education to look at aspects of resistance. And I think we were intrigued that we could see some of it that our participants couldn't see. And we wanted to kind of give light to that in a way that perhaps was a little bit bigger than they were even seeing it themselves. Ros, any thoughts there?
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, definitely all of that. I guess the other thing was, I mean, to some degree, Peter, the whole project began as an analysis of the experiences of academics who were particularly focused on the preparation or the production of, the global graduate, and notions of citizenship and global citizenship were really sort of woven into not only their work, but the way in which their particular practices that we were examining. Now, I'm not saying that we did this consciously, but I think had we had that conversation at the time, might we use other lenses? Might citizenship be a lens? I think we might have felt that we would cause confusion, that we would end up with so many sort of cross themes. And as Bronwyn said, it was that really long-standing history or legacy of scholarship about the nature of academic resistance and the really interesting, very recent re-theorizations of that notion, of that concept that really grabbed our interest and attention.
Thanks so much, Rosalind and Bronwyn. I've got another question, Bronwyn. Like, I guess from the research, how effective do you think academics are as activists? Like, not just necessarily with regards to higher education and their own job positions, but also things with, for example, Just Stop Oil, the climate crisis, etc. From your own research, are we good activists as academics? And I'd just be really interested to know what you think about that as a broader point.
Yeah, well, just going back to my own case and that where I started off with that protest picture, we have saved our secondary education, but it took an awful lot of work, and it was a very good example of collective resistance where we brought in the media, but also really interestingly, our Vice Chancellor said the issues brought on by COVID were bigger than him. And so he took it straight to the government. So we became part of that whole national discussion around what was happening at higher education post-COVID, which for us was just this loss of millions of dollars from international students, which New Zealand and Australia rely on a lot, possibly England as well. So that was why we were falling over, direct result of the loss of that money. So there are examples of quite powerful resistance. And we do believe that education of students can transform the world. That's partly why we are teacher educators. But the really big key is that collectivity and not individualization, because otherwise there's almost nothing you can do. And unfortunately, those neoliberal forces are very, very strong, and we don't always win. And I farewell today 11 colleagues who took voluntary redundancy, and yeah, it's been a tough week. Yeah.
Thanks, Bronwyn. Ros, did you want to contribute at all to that point?
I mean, it's very hard to top what Bronwyn's just said. I would just sort of just throw in a view that, you know, that really emerged for us through the research as well, and through another project that I'm leading, that I'm presenting on at, God help me, in an hour's time. It'll be very late in the night by then. Anyway, and that was sort of really a view that, especially in these kind of what a lot of academics feel to be crisis times, or what we're calling critical times, to see oneself, to understand oneself as engaged in the work of academic resistance, becomes central for a lot of people. I mean, for a lot of our colleagues, for our interviewees, you know, that work of resistance, in a sense, putting effectiveness aside, well, it's effective and important because it becomes even more than before, like a touchstone, you know, for academic labour and identity.
No, absolutely. Thank you. And thank you so much, Bronwyn and Ros, for your excellent presentation, and for, like I said, staying so late into the night where you are as well. As someone who, because of the pandemic, actually spent a year virtually working from Yorkshire to the University of Western Australia, I know how difficult it is. So it's greatly appreciated. Thank you so much. And please continue in the chat as well if you've got any questions for Ros or for Bronwyn there as well. So we're moving on to our third and final speaker of this session. So I'd like to please invite Mark Perkins to share their slides. And this talk is called Reflecting on Educational Leadership During COVID-19, Experiences of Finnish Higher Education Leaders and Lessons for Future Crises and Emergencies. Thank you, Mark.
Great, thank you so much. And we now move from New Zealand to central Finland. So I think the temperature dropped about 35 degrees Celsius. It's about -15 outside here, and the lake in the picture is frozen by now and covered in snow. So thank you all, welcome. What I want to talk today about is exactly what Sam just said, looking at higher education leaders' experiences at a university here in Finland during COVID-19, and seeing what lessons we can pull out of that. So if we're talking about crises, we need to talk about crisis leadership and what crises are. So I've been working right now recently with panel discussions with higher education leaders across Finland, trying to work on helping higher education leaders prepare for crisis and higher education institutions prepare for crisis. And we've been working on figuring out a concept of crisis that we can use. And so this is what we've been working on draft-wise. So we're looking at a crisis blocks or otherwise interferes with an organization's primary functions. We're focusing on organizational crises, of course, such that usual routines and practices are no longer effective, and major negative outcomes, things like operational or drawing from Coombs in 2002, reputational effects may result if the crisis is not dealt with appropriately. Now, when we think of crisis, especially here in 2023, we are thinking about COVID, pandemics, wars. And so it's important to mention that crises are actually really variable. So a crisis can affect an entire organization or just a portion of that organization. So for instance, obviously the COVID-19 pandemic is a crisis, but also if institutional unit, a unit of an organization that is really core for the operation of that organization, if half of their staff leave or are fired, that's a crisis for that organizational unit, just that portion of the organization. And so crises can vary along a wide range of axes, such as scale from a portion of an organization up to global, predictability, onset speed, duration, cause, all sorts of things. I think another distinction that can be useful when we're thinking about crises is to talk about emergencies as potentially being a subset of a crisis that involves imminent and significant risk to the health and welfare of those involved. So a crisis is something where an organization's functions are at risk, and an emergency is that more classic crisis, if you will, where there is a risk to health and safety. So when we take a look at crisis and emergency leadership, the primary research base on that is in the business context. That's where most of the research has been done. And so I wanted to pull a little bit of that research here in to help give context to what we're doing. Probably the most important thing that I will come back to also later is the idea of crises as having phases. So when we think of crisis leadership, we think of the in crisis phase. So we think of that phase that is when the crisis is ongoing, when the pandemic is happening, when the war is happening. But there's also a phase before that happens, the pre-crisis phase. And that's where you can be doing institutional planning to prepare for the crisis, but also you can maybe see the crisis coming. And excellent crisis leadership involves staying in the pre-crisis phase or stopping the problem before it becomes a crisis, so you never actually end up leading in crisis. Then you also have post-crisis, when the crisis is largely resolved, and learning lessons from that. Trends in business crisis leadership really echo trends in educational research as well, or educational leadership. You have a lot of inquiry approaches to crisis response, communication being emphasized, sense-making, transformational leadership, charismatic leadership, all of these things, agency and identity being viewed as valuable. But when we take a look at educational crisis leadership, there is a lot less research on that. A really good recent review was by Streep and Cunningham in 2021. This is work mostly on the K through 12 context, so not necessarily on higher education, but definitely relevant to it. And what they found was 6 major themes relating to crisis leadership in education. The first one is focusing on well-being, a trend we're all familiar with. So what they called providing crisis care. Realizing that roles and responsibilities are going to have to change. They're going to have to adapt during the crisis. Realizing that collaboration is very important. And that's collaboration both within groups at the university or organization and also out with the groups outside of that organization. Then you have multidimensional communication, the importance for communicating from leadership outwards to the rest of the organization and external stakeholders. Similar to adapting roles and responsibilities, you have complex decision-making, and then contextual influences, that who is particularly in charge, what is the culture of the school, etc., is very relevant. So what we want to do is take a look at this and say now, well, how did I investigate crisis leadership here at a university in Finland? And so what I did is the research I'm going to share with you today was a case study at a single unnamed Finnish university where I wanted to explore leaders' experiences of crisis leadership. This was in about 2022 in multiple contexts at the university. And so what I did is I selected leaders. I ended up interviewing 9 participants, snowballed out, and snowballing out, I intended to get variation in institutional hierarchy. So leaders up to the dean level and down at the faculty level who are on shared governance committees, and then also variation within institutional unit, focusing especially on variation in units' ability to easily switch to distance work and distance education. As I said, I ended up interviewing 9 different participants, did 4 different reflection interviews as well with them. And then for the analysis, I was looking primarily at a descriptive analysis, looking at who and which groups were having discourse, influencing the discourses around crisis leadership at the university, and then also a thematic analysis, looking at how crisis leadership was conducted. And then before we dive into the results of that, I want to provide a little context for how Finland did in the pandemic, right? We have so many different countries. We were just talking about New Zealand with extended lockdowns and quite significant interventions. And when we look at when we try to assess how a country did at managing a pandemic, there are so many axes and metrics we get evaluated on. Educational gaps, societal function continuance, how many people were injured or harmed by the pandemic, things like long COVID, for instance. The numbers I'm going to share with us today are looking at excess deaths and looking at death rates. It's an easier metric to quantify. And it gets at, I think, one of the most important consequences of a pandemic, which is people dying. And so excess deaths is a very good way, I think, to look at the effects of a pandemic, because you are looking solely at how many more people died during the event in question compared to the average death rate of prior years in that country or in that area. The important thing with excess death rate measurements is it does not rely on you being able to link a death to a cause. So especially in 2020, for instance, there wasn't good testing. So a lot of people were getting COVID and were dying, but were not actually able to be verified. So on those numbers, as you can see on the slide, Finland did exceptionally well. The EU average excess death rate was 11.9% increase, so a 12% increase in deaths, whereas Finland was only roughly 3%. However, when we look at 2021, we start to see that trend increasing. We start to see them rising to about 7% excess death. And in 2022, their excess death rate was 16.5, was one of the highest, if not the highest in all of the EU, compared to an EU average of 10.2%. These data come from Eurostat. Then, if we look now in 2023, ULA is the Finnish national broadcaster. They have an English language news outlet, and this is an article from that. Probably a little hard to read, so I'll pull the quotes up there. But essentially, one of the local Finnish newspapers is reporting that WHO figures now show Finland to have registered the largest number of COVID deaths per 1 million inhabitants in Europe over the past 12 months. So total number of deaths in Finland has now exceeded 10,000. That number may seem low, but keep in mind Finland only has 5.5 million people total in the entire country. And so 3,000 of those deaths have occurred in the last year. So essentially, what am I saying here with how COVID leadership went? What we can see is that early in the pandemic, the leadership actually went quite well. I'll just pull back to that side. Early in the pandemic, we had relatively low deaths, but later in the pandemic, control was largely lost and you had high death rates. So what are my research questions? So what I'm looking at here is how was crisis leadership practiced at the university during COVID? And so specifically you're looking at which people and groups through what discourses and actions were shaping the university community's COVID response. And then what can we learn about this? I come at the higher education sphere as a biologist, and so very practical mindset of what can we learn about this to help leadership in future crises. So what we want to do to share these results now is to look at these questions sort of one at a time. So I asked sort of who was involved in crisis leadership. And so that's the first thing I want to talk about. Then we'll talk about how was crisis leadership conducted, which is the descriptive analysis. And then we'll talk about what can we learn building a model from this. So for the descriptive analysis, we want to think about who at the university was influencing leadership decisions, was influencing the discourses at the university relating to COVID-19 and crisis leadership decisions. This is looking at this from a perspective of a nexus analysis was the inspiration for this. So what I've got here is I've got a circle here that represents the university community. So all members in here are members of the university community. We've got, say, students down here. We've got teachers, researchers, and staff, and building up the hierarchy to the rector and the university board. And the little hexagons here indicate discourses. So the students within themselves are having discourses. The students have discourses between themselves. Teachers, researchers, and staff members all have discourses within themselves. But then those students and teachers, they have discourses between themselves when they're meeting in classrooms. They're having discussions and discourses. And the teachers, they'll have discourses with a lot of people on this graph, but with, say, department leaders. And they'll have a discourse there up to vice deans and directors and deans and et cetera, et cetera. Then we've got the committees at the organization here, the educational council, research council, et cetera. Outside of this circle is all of the external influences. Potentially, we've got primarily governmental influences, ministries and parliament, Finnish University Association of Rectors is there, professional organizations, personal groups, things like family, neighbors, etc. So what I was really looking at in my research is during COVID, especially 2020 and 2021, there was a huge central discourse about what are we doing for crisis leadership? And what I wanted to figure out through my interviews was who should I draw connections into this large central discourse? Who was dictating and influencing the university-wide COVID crisis leadership? So after the interviews went through and looked at this, and again, this is qualitative, not quantitative, this is essentially what I found. I know it's complicated, but essentially what we're looking at here, the largest single influence was the rector. All interviewees agreed that the rector had ultimate authority and set to the policy at the university. But when we look at who was influencing the rector's decisions, the rector was going out to the Finnish University Rectors Council. But then their major influence was this group right here, the Extended University Management Team. This Extended University Management Team consisted of all the directors and deans of all the units at the university. And so then those individuals would discuss policy, discuss the current situation, get information from their vice deans, from who got the information from their department chairs and other institute leaders, and then they largely discussed the policy. They also created what was called a crisis leadership group or corona monitoring group, and then they extended that out to they themselves didn't really set policy. They brought those suggestions to the Extended University Management Team, who then brought it to the rector. And we can see an association of external groups, especially influencing that monitoring group there. So a couple of observations based on this. We had a major change in structure actually occur. The Extended Management Team was vastly more influential than it had been previously. And so that influence was actually unusual. Before and after COVID, that was largely a sort of information sharing group, not a decision-making group. And so what it actually sort of came down to was their meeting frequency. So the Extended Management Team met twice a week during the crisis. And so problems ended up getting preferentially routed to groups that actually met weekly or more. So some of the classic shared governments groups, they maintained their original meeting schedules and so ended up not being able to be relevant. Another thing I observed was an interesting hybridity between the sort of managerial session, the managerial style, which was often more at the top. And then once you got down to the dean level, you got a very informal, rapid acting networks starting to get observed. I like to call them dendritic networks or organic networks, that where the deans or department chairs, they didn't have time to call faculty meetings. So they'd get on the phone or message the people they thought would be most relevant to that decision there. So that was very interesting, and it worked fantastically in a crisis, but there was a bit of a concern on, say, information flow. So that was who was doing it. Now let's shift gears and talk a little bit about how leadership was conducted. This is the thematic analysis. So to start the thematic analysis, I started off with the themes from Streep and Cunningham's study, those 6 major themes of educational crisis leadership research, and then also explored inductive themes. This is the results of that, formatted for an A4 page so I could share it with my participants. And what we can see here is that the themes are in the circle. So these circle themes here, these are all the themes that were the theory-driven themes, and then these are themes that were emergent from this. What I'm going to do is split this so they're a little bit larger so you can see them. So again, we've got the theory-driven themes over here from Streep and Cunningham, and I found strong support for all 6 of Streep and Cunningham's original themes. So the importance of communication, importance of collaboration, of context, of well-being, both of students and of staff was highly talked about. And then also the importance of adaptive leadership and complex decision-making, which I grouped together because they were very similar and overlap. So lots of discussion of these, very, very important. Emergent themes that came out, and I think especially during COVID, the one that really jumped out as being brand new was the effect of time. And so COVID was such a long crisis that most crisis leadership previous to this had focused on very discrete crises, very short-term crises, and this was a chronic crisis. And so the entire response was affected by time. The crisis phases were very important. The pre-crisis phase probably could have been used a lot better by the university. And people's opinions of what was occurring changed over time. Leadership changed over time, as we'll talk in a second. Planning and preparation was really highlighted as important. Culture kept coming back to, especially in the Finnish context, people kept calling out culture. Information flow, I'll talk more about on a later slide. And then metrics are one that I want to call out here specifically. So metrics are oft vilified as NPM, new public management based kind of work, but their import was actually quite evident. Thanks, Sam. And so in pre-Omicron, what was really interesting, so the Omicron wave was started about December 2021. Before Omicron, the priority of the university campus was to reduce COVID spread in the campus and the community. That was on the start of all of this university management team slides, their meetings. Their first slide of each meeting was, what are our priorities? And this was number one. How did they measure that? Each unit head had to actually report twice a week the number of infected staff and students and the number of quarantined staff and students. And then these data were shared publicly. Now, Finland was actually doing so well at COVID management at this time, they actually had full contact tracing. So they were able to trace the vast majority of COVID infections to figure out where the person got it and who they were in contact with. So this was enabled through public health services of the country. And the result of this was discussions of leadership before COVID, before the Omicron wave, had copious discussions of leaders giving detailed plans of how they were going to align with these metrics, because no leader wanted to be that leader who had 10 people get COVID. Single cases were very big deals. Post-Omicron, the priorities were officially the same. That slide was the same, but infection tracing in the country ended. No replacement metrics were chosen. There was no sharing of data anymore in the management team. And so leaders' discussions really became very almost disjointed, and there was no clear priority or no clear focus, and even clearly stated goals like student well-being had no clear work towards them, or no clear metrics especially chosen or ways to look at it. So what lessons can we learn is sort of the wrap up here. What I did is I integrated the themes together into this model of crisis leadership. This model has 5 interacting elements and really emphasizes the importance of the interaction of them. So for instance, it's critically important to prepare for a crisis, to have redundancy in operations, not just a single office preparing, but the whole campus. You don't have a shelf plan that just sits on the shelf, but you actually have something you've used. But that preparation has to be done with relevance to the culture and context. So the culture and context of your organization are going to influence how you prepare. But then part of your preparation is altering the culture and context, is helping to shape that culture and context. And that sort of interaction we see here, all these different ways. Your preparation influences your adaptive leadership, what metrics you choose, how you're going to look at well-being, how you change decision-making structures. Information flow is very key. Information flow is the way I like to combine both communication, so information going out, and then information flow coming back in, so environmental sensing. So what's key is not just leadership sending information out, but leadership also gathering information about the state of the crisis. And then overhanging all of this is the effect of time. You have crisis phases, worrying about pre-crisis as you see a problem coming up. Pay attention to that. But then also the passage of people's feelings on COVID and on COVID leadership changed dramatically as time went on. So that's pretty much it. And so in conclusion, I think my summary statement is crisis leadership is hard. I would love to have discussions on this either here or offline. My email is there on the bottom of the slide. And so thank you very much. And I look forward to continue our discussion.
Thank you very much, Mark. Perfectly on 20 minutes. If you're able to stop sharing your screen, and then we can facilitate some discussions. If people have got any questions for Mark, please raise your hand either physically or virtually, and I'll come to you. Mark, I could just got a question to start off, if that's okay. I think that the model you presented was excellent and it seemed very flexible, but to what extent do you think that that is grounded in the Finnish experience and how it might be translatable or not to education systems that are slightly different in terms of hierarchies?
That is an excellent question. And so obviously the research is being done in the Finnish context, and so it's based on that. I would be fascinated to talk to others and collaborate with others and explore, is the model applicable to other contexts? I think it is, especially with the centrality of culture and context, in that the way that you prepare, the way you adapt your leadership, the way you alter your information flow has to depend on your own particular culture and context. And so I would say in that way, I'm intending it to be very broad. I think it ended up, I should say, being able to be very broadly applicable. But I'd be interested if there were other factors that showed up in other contexts possibly that I have missed here. So I think it's broad, but would love to find out.
No, definitely. And as people maybe think about some of the questions as well, I've got another question. How well has this been shared with senior leadership teams at your university? And I guess how well received was it? Was it invited, etc.? Would be really interested to hear.
Very good question. And so I have indeed shared it mainly with the participants of the study, who many of whom are in senior leadership positions at the university. And what was actually really interesting was, even though this was based on their statements, so there's very little of me in here, and this is all what the participants are talking about. Every participant I shared this with was actually sort of amazed at how many different elements there were. They had been focusing on, say, communication, or they had been focusing on just preparation or just culture. And so they found it actually quite valuable to realize how many different interacting elements there were that needed to be paid attention to during a crisis. So it was responded to very positively. That said, has it brought about structural change? That's another question that's very difficult.
And I really don't want to try to reduce you to a single soundbite, but I'm going to ask you anyway. If there was, I guess, one piece of advice that you would give to those amongst us who do have, within a senior leadership team, or that have some responsibility to enact change, what would it be, do you think, to really help future crises, etc.?
I would say the biggest thing that we can do to help with crisis leadership is to focus on preparation, and to focus on preparation not just for a particular crisis. Guessing what the next crisis will be is like guessing where the stock market's going to go. It can be very, very challenging. But preparing in ways that can prepare you for multiple different crises. So focusing on, say, redundant operations, or creating redundant systems in place, and focusing on just asking all of your staff, what would they need in a crisis? What crises are they thinking about? And getting crisis leadership happening in a preparation way, not just in the office of planning, or not just in the super senior leadership, but those folks in the trenches, helping them to be able to feel prepared, and paying attention to what they say and what they need to help them prepare. So
thanks, Mark. I think good advice just in general, aside from crisis management as well. Akason, if you've got a question, please, to ask Mark.
Hello, my name's Sandra. Great talk. I really enjoyed that. I have a question about, what you just said, the crises that you can't possibly anticipate, I think. But what you're reading now in the higher education newsletters and so forth are about the Israel-Palestine situation, and how the presidents and provosts and so forth should react, because however they react, there'll be a group that will think that's the wrong reaction. Have you got any comments? Obviously not about the rights or wrongs of it, but about the crisis management side.
Yeah, I think I think that's again an excellent point, and I think recognizing, I think from a leadership perspective, that at the very least, on a lot of institutions on the present day right now, we are in a pre-crisis phase, if not a crisis phase. And so trying to turn on some of that crisis leadership, making sure that information flow is happening, sensing the environment. What's actually happening on your campus? Are you as a leader aware of that? Do you have a leadership team that is meeting to talk about this? And sensing, what does the organization need? I think it's very easy for organizations to wait for a crisis to explode. And one of the lessons that I really got from these leaders is trying to work ahead of that time. As the discussions are simmering, start turning on those leadership mechanisms, start actively paying attention, and start trying to consider, what does your community need in your culture and context? What's appropriate? There aren't any one-size-fits-all solutions in crisis leadership, but I think at least paying attention, starting to talk to people, starting to collect information, and starting to respond rapidly. I think one thing I'll add as well, one of my participants said a very brilliant thing of what I thought was brilliant, which is communicate the uncertainties as well. So often in crises, you either communicate sort of everything, or you say, okay, we're going to make a decision in a week, or we're going to make a decision in 5 days, but what's happening right now? And communicating that uncertainty, I think, can be very, very powerful to help build trust and to let people know that something is happening at a leadership level.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think also you might consider the different levels of management and leadership. Some of what you say sounds like it will work really well at the top, But as you move down, at least my experience, part of my experience was as a head of department. And at that level, you're often just reacting to whatever happens every day. You're often not trained to do anything else. And, you know, people might not follow your lead in the way you would like. Just that would be an interesting area to develop further, I think. Thank you.
And I think your point there on different levels of leadership needing crisis leadership, say training, crisis leadership practice, and to think about crisis leadership is really critical. So often we think about this at the level of the president or the rector or the vice rector, but when you think about crises as a diverse set of possible events, there are so many crises that affect just department chairs, and where that department chair or that faculty member is the lead. So really helping people, that's where I'm hoping to go in my own research is, say, crisis leadership in the academic trenches, if you will. How do we help those folks manage a crisis?
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's great. Thanks so much, Mark, and also Sandra for the question. Some great chats as well in the end. And I'm just going to bring us to a close, if that's okay. So I just want to wrap up by saying thank you so much to our speakers, to Hilary and Fran, Bronwyn, Rosalind and Mark. Thank you very much to Winnie, who's been giving us great technical support throughout all of this. I would encourage everyone, apart from maybe those in a continent quite far from here, to continue on to one of the next sessions. There's obviously lots of interesting things going on today. I'll declare an interest and tell you to all come along to Parallel Session 2.1 because I'll be speaking in that, but all of them have got very interesting talks and conversations. I'd like to thank again all the speakers and all of the participants for respectful and engaged comments and commentary. And look forward to continuing to read about your work and to engage with you across the rest of the conference. So you can leave this session and then the next one will start at 11:45, but feel free to nip in a bit early if you want to. Thanks very much, everyone. Stay safe and speak to you soon. Bye now.